In this video, we're going to look at the freeze panes. Now, if you go to the View tab, you'll see you've got a lot of different things here with the way the workbook views, but then over here under Zoom, you'll see you've got Zoom to Selection, New Window, Arrange All, and then you've got Freeze Panes. And this is what we want to look at. Now, there's three ways to freeze, and then we'll talk about when to use them. Now, when we hit this drop down, you'll notice we've got freeze panes, freeze top row, freeze first column. We're going to start with freeze top row though in the middle and end with this freeze panes. So freeze top row, pretty simple explanation. If we choose freeze top row, you'll notice that it freezes row 1. That's because that's the top row. Now if we unfreeze this, when we scroll down, you'll notice that we don't have to freeze the top row when we're using tables, because with a table we get the column name at the header here showing up anyway. However, when you're doing this with formulas, it does take away the letter, and so it's one of those things that I kind of like to freeze row 1 here so that I can continue to see the letters. But one of the things you have to be aware of is when you do freeze top row, you're going to notice here it freezes whatever row is at the top, which in this case is row 10. So when you do freeze top row, make sure that you have row 1 showing up here, because otherwise you may end up in a situation where you freeze it at row 10 and now you're trying to figure out what happened to rows 1 through 9 all of a sudden. So that's one of the things to make sure you're aware of. Now, freezing the first column will freeze column A, which is a really good idea whenever you are using a lot of column data. So you freeze row 1 when we're talking about a lot of rows. We freeze the columns when we're talking about a lot of columns in which we're going to be scrolling over like this, and that keeps us with the last name. Now, the issue here is the fact that when we're doing this with names, we often end up in a case where we could have a student, for example, using the last name Smith or Johnson in this example. Once we start scrolling over, all of a sudden now we don't know which Johnson we're actually talking about. So there's an issue with freezing top rows, and there's a slight issue here with freezing our last name, which leads me to freeze panes on an active cell. And this is the common method that I tend to use. So when I always freeze panes for database, I click on cell C2, making that my active cell. So when I choose freeze panes, you'll see here keep rows and columns visible while the rest of the worksheet scrolls, and it's based on current selection, my active cell, which could be anywhere on this screen, but I choose C2. Doing so makes row 1 frozen, so I can see the letters for the columns, but also my column headers. It also allows me to see columns A and B and see the names. So for me, anytime I build a database, I click on C2 and I freeze the panes. That way, I always know I'm going to get first and last name. So down here, I know exactly which Johnson I'm looking at. I don't have to try to guess. And it also tells me my column header, but also the column letter. That way, if I'm working with formulas, for example, if I'm down here somewhere working on a formula, I know which column I'm looking at. So that's when you're talking about freeze panes. Remember, it's under the View tab, and you've got those 3 options to work with. And which one you choose depends entirely on what you're doing, but the best option that I usually pull is this freeze panes, because of the fact that it's going to freeze at C2, first and last name, plus my column headers.